Can I get someone in the back to close the door, please? It's time. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the STIR meeting. This is STIR. If you're not here for STIR, stay anyway.
So as always, we start with the note well. So please pay attention to your responsibilities to participate and make sure that you've read all of these before you contribute. Next slide. Please treat each other with respect. It's okay to disagree on ideas, but don't attack people. Just please be respectful. Next slide. Remember, in-person participants, make sure you log in for the to update the blue sheets, and remote participants, please make sure your audio and video are off unless you're trying to engage with the meeting, and headsets are strongly recommended. Next slide.
Let me add something. We do have some remote participants today. I know sometimes we lose discipline on remembering to use the queuing mechanism. Please try to do that. Not to lose discipline, but please try to use the mechanism.
Please use the raise hand mechanism in the Medico tools. And
So John's got a slide on these. So I wonder if we want to just defer to that right after this,
okay.
except for the myth.
Yes, the passport RCD is still waiting on the SIPCOR document to catch up. Hopefully, the chair of SIPCOR can make that happen real soon. Staring at her.
Well, they just made some changes. Yeah.
Yep. All right, so this is the agenda. We have a minute taker. Thank you very much. Medico takes care of the blue sheets. We will watch the jabber to see if there's anything that needs to be brought to the attention of the room. So we don't need a jabber scribe. Is there any agenda bash?
Just the minor bash that I mentioned just a minute ago. We have, I guess John will talk to the first two of the drafts that were on our status sheet just a minute ago.
Okay, hearing none. Ben's going to bring up John's slides.
John, you want to do that one first? The update, okay. Okay.
All right, look at that. Hello, welcome. Yeah, so just a couple points on drafts that we have in flight that are escaping the ISG. I'm going to do the second one first. So we now have sent 4916, sorry that says 4169. It is in fact 4916, John Elwell's classic draft on having identity work in the backwards direction for the original RFC 4474. That is post-working gas calls, now PubRac, as I did manage to clean up the innumerable irrelevant references that were cluttered in the back of it and sorted those properly into normative and informative ones, so that should be good. But with the ISG already is the OOB service provider document. And we need some clarification in this. You know, I think we long ago agreed here. And for those of you who have no idea what this document is, this is a revision basically to an earlier specification that was RFC 8816 that first defined the out-of-band architecture for STIR. And it was informative and kind of loosey-goosey and frameworky, and like you could do it this way, you could do it that way. But it did have in it like a REST flow that determined like, okay, if you have a passport and you're concerned that that passport is not going to reach the terminating side because there might not be end-to-end SIP in the middle, then you can kind of store a copy of it up in a web service, and the terminating side can go check when it receives a call that does not have such a passport in band to see if there's one out of band. And if it looks like it matches the call, you can go with it. Pretty cool. The REST system we defined for that was like, okay, but we did put in a little like line at the end of it that said, yeah, and if you really want to do a complete specification of this, you should probably like do some more work later. So service provider OOB does not actually do that work. What it basically does is it says, let's do a down ref. And for those not familiar with this in IETF parlance, a down ref is when you have an RFC that is standards track, that is relying on an RFC that is informative normatively. And like that's kind of a no-no, but you can call it out in the IETF last call for it. And if people are cool, you can go forward with it. The argument I'm making is basically the specification is probably sufficient for that REST interface in order for it to go forward. And the tack I propose for this is to figure out a way to specify what is mandatory to support in the case that you're doing this service provider OOB use case, and then what isn't. And the reason why I want to leave it kind of loosey-goosey like that is precisely because I envision there could be multiple ways for terminating relying parties to end up acquiring that passport from our call placement service. It could be a push. It could be a subscription where then ultimately you say, I want any passports for this set of numbers or these set of resources to come down to me. And so what I pitched to our distinguished AD, who I'm glad has joined us, was something along the lines of, we'll specify it's like mandatory to implement effectively the REST interface that's in RFC 8816. And then we'll have like May-ish stuff for what that subscription interface that we haven't specified yet might look like. What I don't want to do really is just close the door on this and say the only way you're going to do this is with like gets and posts, right? And because there do seem to be some other potentially more useful ways to cast this. And I owe you a mail about this, I know, but just from that description, that's kind of what I have in mind, right? And I think probably the description that's in 8816 is like sufficient for that simple get and post use case. I just want to be able to must that out, say must implement that, but like, you could also implement a subscription interface in order to receive these things on, more of a pull-ish or more of a push-ish situation on the terminating side. If I did that roughly, does that sound cool? Does that sound not cool? I know you just walked in and like, yeah.
Hi, Ori Steele, responsible area director. So there was a couple back and forth points in our email over the document. I think the main concern that I had with the normative reference to the REST interface is it says sort of at the bottom is there enough there for implementers to consistently implement the parts that are there? It's fine that if there are other interfaces, other ways to handle it, that's great. But is there enough meat in that reference for a normative reference for people to understand what they need to do? And if there isn't, I think I sent in my email like,
yeah, here's a get, here's a post.
Take the parts
this.
that you need and put them in your document, and then say, and you can do other stuff like what's described there in other areas. That was my suggestion, but we can maybe chat offline a bit more about how you guys want to handle that particular document and any of the other updates.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the main thing, the reason why we're bringing this up now is really to ask the question of, if we make a change along these lines, right, is this something we feel like should come back to the working group for another consensus call? Do people think this is kind of close enough to what we discussed in last call that it would be cool if we went forward with this? And I don't know if people here have strong feelings about that either way. But.
So this has been, speaking from the front, we did do a call for objections on that down ref when we promoted this document to standards track.
Yes, we did.
So we did have that discussion. Now, that doesn't mean we were right.
Well, no,
if Ori thinks we need to do something different, that's great. But
this is more if we took the more substantive material about the REST interface and kind of jam that into service provider OB, right? Like, would that require us to come back here for another last call, or do you think we can proceed with that? Is the question.
I don't know. I would have to see.
Like to see the
I'd have to see what you put.
It won't be much. That's my point, right?
my sense is like probably not. If you're comfortable with the reference as you put it there, you probably would be more comfortable with the smaller, more precise language that we're considering.
Yeah.
But I have to see it to be
All
able
right,
to answer that.
yeah. Okay. Robert?
So, Robert Sparks, chair hat off. You're putting more effort into this than it really needs for what the industry needs to see that they're going to be developing towards. The vision that this lays down is important to lay down. I think there is sufficient detail, even without extra work, that we aren't going to end up with fielded incompatible implementations, and that would just serve everybody to just let this go. So,
So Robert, just so I understand, you think the reference as is sufficient for implementers to implement consistently, and that if we go forward without pulling that text from the reference out and specifying it normatively in the document, that there won't be any implementation challenges that would arise from that path, including if the section and the reference in the future are rewritten or changed in some way, as it says at the last paragraph.
It is pretty brain dead rest. I mean, I hope. But Robert,
say,
yeah.
say what you said again.
I said, I think it is pretty brain dead rest, right? The system we're envisioning here, it really is like put a cookie in the jar and somebody comes and takes it out, right? We're
Yeah,
not doing anything
that's
fancy.
That's exactly it. And I don't think anybody's poised to run away with this thing. If it starts to get significant deployment traction, there would be more efforts around refining what's being said. I don't object to us doing the work to move this stuff around, but I think that we've got a finite number of cycles and a small number of people pushing stuff around, and I don't know that the payback is worth the effort.
Last point on this, if that's the feeling within the group, let's make sure that that's documented on the list, that we've got it all there. And it's okay to disagree with the area director when they give you a review. It's fine. I take feedback. So if it's not just your position, but it's the position of the wider group, and we have that on the list, I feel comfortable going forward with it as long as we've got enough references around it. Still my position that when you have normative references, you should button them up as much as you can. And I have the energy to help you accomplish that if you want help with it. But, at the end of the day, this is for you guys as chairs. So if you're comfortable with it and there's enough documentation around it, I'm good.
Jonathan, can you make sure the minutes capture that we have an action item to check that on the list?
So basically to bring to the group the idea of not doing anything and see if they all agree that's okay.
Right.
And I will reiterate that I don't have a problem going ahead and
Yeah,
doing this refinement.
of course,
But
yeah. And I agree. I mean, if we're basically just taking the 8816 text and putting it into here and sprinkling some normativity on it, like it's not going to have an appreciable impact on the way I envision this being deployed. I'll put it that way, right? So like, sure, okay. But I think that's it for this update. Got an action item, got a direction.
I see we're done with the slides. That slide.
Yeah.
Get that deck.
Rory, are you out of the queue now?
John, you're up.
Sure, why are you sitting down?
Today I'm going to be sitting down. Now Chris is going to be standing up and doing stuff today. It's very exciting.
As long as you don't make me stand.
You don't have to stand up anymore. Well, thank you. So yeah, this is also going to be pretty brief. This is a one-slide presentation. Next slide. Okay, thank you. There's actually 3 slides. There is a slide that says next steps after this, but like the meat of the slide is simply this presentation. All right, so we've done a bit of work in the past couple of months to try to get our freshness drafts all up to date. So what are the freshness drafts? Basically, we looked at a couple of different approaches to being able to ascertain that certificates are actually fresh. It doesn't work quite the same way as it does for in traditional PKI because we added in RFC 8826 a little bit of extra spice to these. And, there is an inherent dynamism to number assignment. People are familiar with things like number portability. And of course, just numbers get activated and deactivated all the time. And so when you talk about credential having the authority to sign for a big block of numbers, exactly how you manage that and figure out, is this certificate valid for this particular number at any given time as a relying party when a call comes in, can be tricky. And so we ended up with two approaches, doing this with the Online Certificate Status Protocol, OCSP, and as well with short-lived certs. And we endlessly spun around the maypole of like, is one of these better than the other? Like, can we only do one of these? And we ultimately ended up with the notion that no, they probably both have their place. And indeed, even more so than letting the market go ahead and shake this out, we think there may be niches in which both of these are going to turn out to be relevant in STIR deployments. Next slide. So what's new? So there's a 0.8 version of OCSP now. We now have examples of the request and response that actually use the 8826 extension in it. Previous ones did not. I would like to give my thanks to my co-author, Sean Turner, and to our esteemed co-chair, Wes Housley, for their assistance in getting those things up to date. No way I could have done that myself, trying to hack that out, like, with OpenSSL on my Linux box. One little note about that, it was pointed out that we use examples that have .cer as the suffix for certificates that are in this document. And really, that's not quite true, because the way that X5U communicates certificates you're going to find is actually in PEM, and this is not an appropriate suffix to use for PEM certificates. However, when I started looking under the hood, and this is back to Chris and I years and years ago, we use .cer in everything, in 8224 and 8225 and all the core STIR specifications, every extension, because we just wrote one example, right, of the JOT header for this and just copy pasted it forever. And I'm just not sure this document is the place to set the record straight on this matter. And so for the moment, I am keeping it in. Honestly, I suspect it is hard-coded in a lot of implementations of STIR that are out there, which is more than a few at this point. And let's not suggest that they have to change or break something to be compliant with the way that we're doing OCSP. But with this, I think probably our OCSP story is complete, as long as no one is really going to yell about us keeping in the examples that .cer suffix. Anybody going to yell about that? It's kind of wrong, but man, it's been kind of wrong for 10 years. Yes. Yes, we're going to do BISs of everything in order to get this nailed down, because that's how we work in the IETF. All right. So that's it on OCSP. That should be good ship. And at last, after I don't know how many versions of this I've been kicking around, draft Peterson IETF search short-lived has become a working group item and is now back at 0.0. And we did a bit of work in this to make sure that we got X5C basically correct. So what do I mean by that? So traditionally in STIR, you use X5U in the JOT header to signify the certificate that was responsible for signing this passport. Very handy. If you don't have it already, you can just go download it from that HTTPS URL, use it to validate the passport. But a lot of the promise of using short-lived is that in fact we will be pushing the certificates by value instead through a separate JOT header that is called X5C. And X5C has support for, as the C suggests, a chain of certificates that will appear there. And we did this time actually from the TransUnion implementation. I had them make a valid example of how X5C should look in this with the RFC 8226 extensions in it. We did, in response to some of the comments we got last time, we have some text now that allows both X5C and X5U to be present. And this is largely for backwards compatibility. We just fear there are so many STIR implementations that use X5U and that really only support that it may take a while to get people up to speed on X5C. So right now we're kind of yeah, you could have both if you really wanted to. But a question arose on the list just the other morning, pointing out that X5C is not currently a must. And, it's recommended. And the reason it's not a must is, again, our concerns about these backwards compatibility sorts of issues that arise around all this. But the value in this almost entirely is in sending the certificates by value, because this is what lets you get around the round trip times you would need to do to then go and access the certs. And, the objective of this, as with OCSP, remember that in OCSP, I guess 2 revisions ago, we went to some small trouble to get stapling in the base version of this, precisely because we wanted to avoid having to get that, RTT from OCSP being dipped by relying parties on the terminating side, now pushing a staple with that. To get this to a level of parity with that, we really need to be using X5C to get the full cert chain by value delivered. So let's discuss a bit about whether X5C should in fact be a must in this. Jonathan, since you raised it, please.
Jonathan Rosenberg from 5.9. I don't think it's a backward compatibility problem because it's not saying that all STIR implementations must do this. It's just saying one's compliant to this specification must do this. So like, I don't see a problem with having this at must strength for this document, right?
Okay.
And like you said, it's like pretty much useless without it. So
I mean,
it should is waffle,
useless
waffly,
is a strong-
waffly.
Useless is a strong word. It will still work with X5U.
Right, but
And you
it
will
does
still
not
be able to-
accomplish. It does not accomplish the.
It does not
purpose for
accomplish
which-
the data minimization goal, which
Right.
is maybe perhaps the main one, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And yes, you get a performance hit from it. But at the same time, it provides a way that it's easy to manage short-lived certificates for cases where, for example, you want to keep an enterprise like on a short leash. You want their certificate to expire like very, very rapidly. We need a mechanism that provides that property, even if it doesn't satisfy our data minimization goals and our elimination of RTT goals. So you could argue that it still can provide value without that, right? Because right now there's
When
really
you're
no.
saying so if it's used selectively, for example.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
But I'm not wed to this. I mean, if people want to insist that X5C, should be must for this, I see other people in queue. It's just they come
Excellent.
forward and opine.
Alec?
Alec, how's it going, man? You should do these things. I never see you anymore.
I know. Could do one in Atlanta.
Yeah.
So I actually raised my hand not in response to this. So I don't know if it was a different thing related to X5C. So I don't know, Chris, are you commenting on whether it should be must or should? Maybe you should go first.
Yeah, I can go. So I just wanted to clarify, you're talking about must for a verification service to support X5C, right?
No, I think this
Specifically,
is
or
much more a must for authentication
even
service.
authentication.
Yeah.
Okay.
Must use.
Must use.
I'm pretty supportive of must. So, but
Of
I
a
want-
must
I
use
just
at
wanted to ask
AS.
that. I wanted to ask that question.
Okay.
Yeah, that was part of the point that we went down this road was to not have the double transaction.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. And Alec, you going to ask about us dropping the root cert from the chain?
How did you know?
Because you wrote to the mailing list about this at one point, and I seem to recall. I just remembered now. What would Alec want to talk about?
Yes, that's exactly it. I don't see a reason to include the root. They have to have it in their trust list, and it's X5C. It matters. I mean, in X5U, it's less of an issue to include unnecessary data, but here, that's a lot of extra bytes to put in every passport.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly in a shaken context, I completely agree that you're guaranteed to have that root there. I mean, but even broader than that, I can see the argument that look, if you trust the root, you already have it, right? Even outside of in any conceivable deployment environment for this. If you trust the root, you probably have a copy of the root already. And if you don't, there's something even more weird and nefarious going on here, right? So ultimately, yeah, that's probably reasonable. There probably are.
I mean,
looking at the size of the X5C example that they put in, that is a lot of bytes that
Yeah.
are there to deliver that root cert.
I mean, in TLS, like the web server, when you're setting up TLS handshake, you send the end entity and any intermediates. You do not send the root. It's just in broad TLS on the internet. The assumption is the client has the root. I
Yeah, so
think
why did, because, I just stole this from 7519, right? And like the 7519 example works this way, which is why we built our example to look just like 7519 did. So does anybody remember
I'd be
why?
curious to ask.
What's that?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know why anyone would do that. Maybe I'm missing something, but I can't think of any reason.
Yeah, it might be worth our time to actually ask those guys, like why it works that way. If there is like some particular reason they had to want the root cert to be in there for X5C, but I think in general principle, I'm on board. Let's just double check that and make sure that like we aren't missing something.
Sounds good.
I was just going to say, I thought in general, the having the root or not having the root is always generally supported. And if you want to get if you want your certificate to be valid, you sort of know the ecosystem that you're playing in and whether or not they have the root cert or not. So I thought that was just sort of general practice, but I don't know, maybe others.
Well,
can
that's why
confirm it.
I was sitting here thinking, is there a stirrish environment I could imagine that's more pluralist about the root certs that you're associated, but probably not, that actually matters. So let's just take an action item, let the minutes reflect. Let's take an action item to like double check with Jose people about this and make sure that, or is that OAuth now? I don't, who even does that now? So check with Jose people and just make sure that like we're not accidentally stepping in something we shouldn't. But that is it. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we resolved this. I think, next slide. What's that? Yeah, that's true. Oh, yeah. People like Must. So yeah, let's take a last call to room on this. I mean, and we could even take like a hum or a vote or something. We never use the tools.
A
in this
raise
group.
hand tool.
Yes, use the raise hands tool. All right, so let me explain real quick. Go back one slide, please, just so we have it up. So just to explain what this is once more, right?
Alex and Q, by the way.
Oh, Alec, do you want to say something first?
Alex, out of
Okay,
queue now.
I'll get it to you. Okay.
I'll come back. It was not related to the must, so I'll come back after
Okay.
that.
So what this is, like, remember, vanilla passports, RFC 8225 passports only use X5U. So we're adding X5C as like a new feature. The purpose of this new feature is to be able to convey certificates by value, more or less entirely for the case where short-lived certs are being issued by intermediate CAs. So it will be a 3-cert chain, right? That at least that leads down to the identity cert on that. And so what we want to ascertain here is, do we believe that the optimization we get from not requiring anybody to go like download stuff with X5U, because that's like an HTTPS like RTT, do we believe that like that is bad enough that for the cases, where we're using short-lived certs, we want there to be a mandatory to use, not to support, but to use X5C. And chairs, you can
So I've
call
got,
that
should we say that the AS must use X5C?
X5C for cases where you're using short-lived certs. It's only within the scope of this
Let's
draft.
just this draft, right?
Yes,
The
okay,
draft.
okay, for this draft, yes.
I'll see.
Should
Should this draft say?
this draft say must use X5C for authentication services? I have to vote myself, don't I?
So it cut me off. It's too long. Let me redo that.
Remember we used to hum?
Okay,
I
we
Yeah,
know
I
what it
remember
says.
when we used to.
Okay. The text doesn't say must
Sorry.
use what, but it means must use X5C.
Yeah, we have a question, sorry.
So John, this is with us. I just want to make sure that, is there any implication in other places that has to be changed, or after, say, for example, this, when the RFC, if it is must, then, for example, second, do you have to do anything there?
Well, I mean, if Shaken chooses to be compliant with the eventual
Short-lived,
RFC
right?
that results from this, then that would be something they would either have to override or accept. I mean, I would leave that to the more Shaken-y people in the room to answer. Chris, do you have any feeling about that?
I would like to hear from Chris.
Well, I don't think we're going to change the base shaken specs. So I anticipated this being more for delegate certificates and other things that we pretty much intended to use short-lived certs and other things like that.
Yeah, this is not a change to baseline Shaken operations of like, this is a change to this very narrow delegate certificate case for Shaken. Okay,
Right. I was going to actually expand on that a bit. The baseline Shaken implementation entirely uses SBCs, not TNs. And this is for the new part of Shaken that may someday use TNs. That's not anything to be backwards compatible with.
yes.
We have, by the way, we have a couple of no's. Does anyone want to, numbers don't add up. I have a couple of no's. Does anyone want to defend the no position?
Hi, Ben. This is Pierce.
Go ahead, Alec.
Pierce, Alec.
The other Alec. This is Pierce. I wish I was the other Alec. My reason for saying no is because it's not clear that it wouldn't be a must for Shaken. Now, if there's some way to make sure that it's that it's not, that it's clear that it's not a must for Shaken, then I would change my no to a yes.
But expand on that, like why shouldn't it be must for Shaken, hypothetically, in the sense of the point of doing this by value is again to eliminate those RTTs, right? And to make it so as soon as a request appears, the relying party is able to ascertain whether or not it's verifiable. So what don't you like about it?
You'll end up with a whole bunch of uninterruptible, I can't even talk, uninterruptible implementations, STIVS implementations, and no way to enforce cleaning it up.
Would it make you feel better, Pierce, if we also had in the document, which we do, a thing saying you may include X5U as well? So in case you can't parse X5C or don't have anything to do with it, you can rely on that.
Well, I don't write STIVSs. What do you think, Alec?
I guess it's unclear to me how this impacts Shaken, because Shaken doesn't reference this document, right? So anything you put in here, you can write must all day long. The Shaken implementations, at least, ATIS documents that define it, which are what really are defining it, reference not 8226. So it doesn't really matter what 8226 says. But I actually am bringing it up kind of from a different perspective. I think that's a problem in the sense that we want X5C to be possible in Shaken. There's short-lived certs kind of from this document, and then there's just people using certificates following all the existing documents that have existed for years that are on the short-lived side. And there would be an advantage if people could start using X5C today. So I don't really know how this all interops, but I do think it'd be nice if we could get X5C optional. That does kind of making it needs to be a must on the VS side though, which to Pierce's point, that's a problem. But on the flip side, I would say the solution is to have X5C in there, X5U as well. I don't know, but I don't think this has any impact on Shaken because it doesn't reference these documents. This document.
I mean, it might someday reference this document, right, Alec? Or I'm sorry, did ATIS decide to not liaise with the IETF and rely on its specifications anymore sometime?
Well, no, but I just meant the current document doesn't reference this. ATIS
Okay.
1074, 80, like those documents don't reference this. So if you make this must now, it doesn't just immediately change it. And
Okay.
but I'm kind of saying that in a bad way. The ATIS 1080 doesn't reference this document, so I think ATIS or RFC 8225 is it that I'm thinking of? The base passport doesn't allow X5C,
Yeah.
if I recall. And that's really the core issue here. Not so much like adding it here doesn't help you if you in another document say you can't use it, and because you don't
Yeah,
want to
but-
get rid of that reference.
Yeah, but we do occasionally, I understand, things kind of trickle down. You know, we put out an RFC and Addis like may do something as a result. They're not forced to, but that would be the idea, I think. But Chris?
It's a, I guess one last comment I'll just say, it's a little funky with like shake inserts, because I don't think we're saying all shake inserts are short-lived. So it
Right.
doesn't make sense to say you have to use an X5C from authentication. If you're using a long-lived cert, it would be dumb to use an X5C, right?
Yeah,
You're
no,
adding
no,
a
of
whole bunch of
course.
bytes.
But
But if you're
again,
using short-lived certs that are shake inserts, so you kind of get in this situation where what's your lifetime of your cert? The same, shake inserts in the same environment. If they're shorter-lived certs, you probably prefer X5C. If they're longer-lived certs, you probably prefer X5U.
yeah, and to be clear, there is no intention of having this must apply to anything other than short-lived certs.
What's
That
a
may not
short-lived
have
cert?
been in the vote, right? But
What's a short-lived cert?
yeah, I get it. But like,
Oh, that's the problem, Mike. Is all
well,
I'm
that
saying.
is an Addis problem. Operationally determining what counts as short-lived, that is not an IETF problem. I can tell you that.
Right.
Well, I think
But it's exemplary. It's not like,
yeah, I was going to ask another question, but just to comment on that last point, like I think that was the point of this short-lived. Like this is a specifically separate technique, a specifically separate tool that we want in the tool bag. Because you use 8220 or because you use X5U, that might have a short lifetime. That's not the same as what this document's talking about. My question was going to be, do we know, I guess I could have looked it up while we were having that other discussion, but do we know in JWT, can you have an X5C and an X5U? Can you have multiple? And what happens if they point to, they describe two different certificates and like some of those issues? We might want to just double check on that.
yeah, I mean, I did look at 7519 on this, and I don't recall it saying you couldn't have both, but we should double check, obviously. And yeah, the question of which you would rely on in that instance is an interesting one if the contents are not identical. I can imagine a lovely attack threat surface that opens up from that, can't I?
Good forensics. Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". There is actually a backwards compatibility problem related to X5U though, right? Which is if the AS doesn't know if the VS supports this extension, and the VS only looks, and you have an older one that doesn't support X5C at all, whether or not the X5C is must or should, the real thing is the X5U must always include the X5U if you're using this draft and you put the X5C in. So that comes back to this question of like, if you can't have both, we have a problem.
Yeah.
So
Well, if we can't have both, we'll override it here. I mean,
we'll override it.
yeah. If we literally can't have both, like the way that 7519 is written, we will say we need to update 7519.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
okay, got it. All right, that's what you mean. Yeah. So my point is, like, if we agree to do must for X5C, the document has to say you must still include the X5U for backward compatibility.
So that would be a change from what we have now. Now it is optional to do that, to also include the X5.
But like, am I missing something? Right?
No,
I mean,
hear
like,
ya. Well, I mean, yeah, the result would just be verification fails, like if it's unsupported. But like, verification may fail for being unsupported if you don't already have like enough sauce to, yeah. Well, I'm just saying, even if your X5U delivers you a certificate chain like this, if you don't support, so it should work. I agree. All right. So what I'm taking away from this is we should probably be looking at musts for both. And that with musts for both, we need to do, as I hope Jonathan is noting, a little bit of study of 7519 to make sure that that is in fact legit, and if not, what it would take to allow us to do that. Hopefully not having to specify our own new header called X5 Shmoo. We've done worse. All right, so X-X5.
That was all complicated, so everybody please look at the notes, make sure I wrote down what you said.
Okay, I'll take a look when
Not
I
my job.
when I'm off stage. I'll take a look. But I think I'm now off stage because I think that's it. So next step slide. I think OCSP probably is good to go as written now. And short-lived, I mean, we'll get some more stuff in on that and hopefully get a last call. Alec, parting remarks.
This is too complicated and we shouldn't do this, but I guess I just have a comment that I think if we talk about the root and the root's wasted bytes, I think in many deployments, the intermediate is going to be wasted bytes too. And I don't think there's an easy way to do this and it's probably not worth it, but it seems like it would be really nice if we could kind of have a way to, you want an embedded end entity cert and a referenced intermediate for some deployments because the intermediate are long-lived certs, very long-lived. And it's too complicated, but it seems just so silly to put the same intermediate in millions and millions and millions of these passports.
Yeah. Again, I'm trying to think about this in shaken terms, right? Where we imagine it is the job of the PA to make sure that all relying parties have those root certs. Whose job is it in shaken? Question for you guys, I guess, to make sure that, or is there a job indeed needed to make sure that who the intermediates are? And, because what this leads to is okay, I need to go fetch the intermediate cert if I don't already know it, and I'm going to use X5U for that, right?
Right.
And then rely on the EE cert that is in the X5C. Is that what you're talking about?
That's a potential implementation, but yeah, you're right. You don't pre-have the intermediates, but let's say you have X5U, and from a shaken perspective, the ATA standards are actually very specific. The X5U response must include the end entity and then any intermediates in order.
Yes.
You're not allowed to include the root. It's very specific. So you would basically say the X5U is going to have that response, and then the X5C is the end entity only. And if you don't have the intermediate you need, you dereference with the X5U, but then because you've cached it, the next time you don't have to dereference it, and you're saving an entire cert in every one of those passports.
I'm just worried. I see where you're going for. Let's save as many bytes in this as possible. I'm just worried again about multiple intermediaries and chaining of these things, and
I agree.
Yeah.
It's complicated. It's
Yeah.
probably not worth it.
Jonathan,
but I
you
just
think
wanted to
it's
bring
not
up.
complicated?
Real
I-
quick,
okay.
real quick. We're halfway through the meeting. I'm closing the queue after Jonathan. And I think we're kind of now at the point of doing some really interesting idea engineering at the microphone that might need to be
Yes.
taken offline.
Probably best.
I'm about to do some engineering at the microphone. So
Okay.
since we already concluded that when the X5C is present, you have to have the X5U anyway, right? You therefore have the intermediate chain by reference from the X5U.
Yeah.
So you could specify that the X5C only contains the leaf.
Yes.
That's it.
Russ, explain to me again how certification paths are constructed if you only have an end entity cert and there is arbitrary and intermediaries between you and a root that you trust, and that may in fact include different paths that cover multiple intermediaries when you're building a certification path.
It works. The SKI will tell you which one. As long as they don't have
Okay,
the
so-
same public key,
Yeah.
you're safe.
So you can always, if you just have the SKI in the EE, you can
Yep.
always use that to get the entire certification path back.
Correct.
And
One
if
hop
the
at a time.
certification path is not certs, you already have cache for the intermediaries, then you can, okay,
And
okay.
from
If
that,
that's true,
and the
then-
shaken CR will let you
Yeah.
fetch them if you have to. But Jonathan already pointed out they're in the other payload.
Yeah, yeah, if they're on SIU, that makes sense. Yeah, I was much more thinking again, just would it be possible to make a mistake if I got the EE cert and I thought I knew what the intermediaries would be, but I was wrong? But if the SKI is always going to take you,
Yes.
let you build the entire certification path backwards just from the EE cert, then there's not a security problem there.
So the attack that you were postulating is that the X5U and the X5C must have the same leaf cert in them.
Yes.
Otherwise,
Yes.
That isn't true. So there's really 3 musts.
Jonathan, you getting all this? So the third must is that, the X5U and the X5C must have the same EE cert in them.
Yep.
It may be that there's more than one valid certification path that could be built
That's-
backwards
okay.
from the EE cert to the root, but that's where I was going, right? But the SKIs will always lead you to what the path needs to be
Right.
to construct that backwards.
Yep.
This is always the devil of these things with because you can end up with all these weird parallel configurations where this could actually go to 2 roots, for example, because of cross certification and things like
Yes.
that. And
Shaken doesn't allow all that stuff.
okay.
Yet.
I thought this was a simple must-should conversation.
Well, what we've ended up with is a lot of musts.
Well,
So
right
I
now,
hope people like the musts that we've gotten out of this conversation.
people were all talking about how much they love must just a minute ago.
Yes, it is getting very musty. I am feeling kind of musty up here, and there are other drafts to discuss. I think we've got this captured for this round.
So quick question, OCSP draft good to go. Does that mean ready for working group last call?
Ready for working group last call.
Anyone think it's not?
I don't think it is. You didn't put the 3 musts in yet.
No, that's short-lived. That's short-lived.
Okay.
Not OCSP. OCSP, with the great work that yourself and Sean did, should now have examples that actually work in it. And we've got our staples in it and everything else we said we wanted in it. It should be good to go.
Okay.
Short-lived, it sounds like we're going to do a little spin on that before that's going to advance any further.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm hearing no objections to working group last call for OCSP, so the chairs will endeavor to get to that sooner than they usually do.
Chris?
Yeah, there was a lot there. I hope we've not captured it all, but please look at the right front. If you think I didn't write down what you said, okay.
It's not showing me Chris's slides. Let's see. Hang on just a second. It says they're there. Refresh this. Okay, I refresh this. Let's try again. It's not letting me scroll. Oh, there he is. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Boy, look at all those names.
So yeah, we're on 03, but 02 to 03 was only mostly a formatting issue that I was fixing. So it's all inclusive of 2 and 3.
Could you talk to the microphone instead of, yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So I presented this at the last, at 119. We got some good feedback. We also put a bunch more thought into this. I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page about the intent. It's a lot, we're sharing a lot of the concepts from certificate transparency from Web PKI side of the house, or the browser forum. But we decided to get more opinionated in this draft, I guess. So I think the intent, just to sort of go back to the basics, there's different, there's sort of, STIR has been adopted in the whole concept called STIR Shaken, but there's different ecosystems, different things that we're looking to build in terms of delegate certificates, TNs, things into the future. There has been questions in the industry, whether real or not, in terms of threats of can you trust the certificates and things like that. So the thought is really behind trying to make sure that we have all the tools available to make, in particular, I think delegate certificates with TNs trustable, because somebody may want to claim a TN that they're not authorized to claim. I think that's a big threat vector. That could happen with SPCs, although some of the current ecosystems have mechanisms to prevent those things, but it doesn't hurt in that situation as well. So using the general framework of certificate transparency, the ability to monitor logs, to require a SCT receipt to be part of a passport. So we define a new claim in this draft that allows you to attach either a single receipt or multiple receipts if you've provided your certificate to multiple logs. So it has the benefit of providing trust, uniqueness within potentially cross-STIR ecosystems. So like I could see this also providing trust across, multiple jurisdictions or other things like that. I don't know. Those are the concepts I want us to explore and ask questions about. Next slide. Oops.
Nope. There you go.
So I think, as I said, we abandoned the first attempt we had was to try to align with RFC 9162, but we sort of abandoned that. And like I said, became much more prescriptive, much more opinionated about how we think this would work based on how STIR certificates are generally created and the pathways that they take. We define a different and specific API for submission of logs, getting SCTs, and how you monitor, so querying the logs so that you can check. We also abandoned any specific way of defining a specific append-only log. I think that may be a general trend as well, but definitely would like feedback on that if anybody thinks that that matters. But really, at the end of the day, we only use the SCT receipt as the thing that we borrow most explicitly from from RFC 9162. Next slide. Oh, I guess that's it for that discussion. Any comments, questions around certificate transparency? Russ?
So what do you use from 9162? Because in the web PKI, no one implements 9162.
Well, that's say the other number. Okay, that's fine.
Because
I can change it to that number. Yeah.
They do version 1 today. No one has moved to version 2.
Okay, can do that. I guess I saw that it was
Yeah, I know, but that's not reality.
obsoleted, but okay. I have no issue doing that because I don't think that definition changed anyways. So,
John?
any questions about the
Got
concepts?
training queue.
Hey, yeah, obviously, I thought this is a good idea for a long time, and especially as we start looking at more intermediary certification authorities that are issuing certs, being able to keep track of what gets issued there seems like super important. There was one thing actually, and I just had to go look it up in the draft after I saw it on the previous slide. When you talk about in the draft what the role of the monitor is in actually like working with these logs. And I'm interested in like the kind of TN collision problem in this and how you envision that working in practice. Because we know, unfortunately, there are a lot of originating service providers. This is a classic sort of shaking problem who originate, who are receiving calls from a single enterprise, right? And one of them is the TNSP, as we call it, the telephone number service provider who issued the telephone number from which these calls are originating. So like, how do you see the role of the monitor as mitigating these circumstances where in fact, because unfortunately I can kind of imagine a world where people will create these delegate instruments at multiple carriers for the same number. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you're trying to prohibited, the monitor would flag with that? Or is this something where really, again, it's kind of up to the relying party to say, okay, it turns out if I look at the log, there are a number of different entities that all have certificates for this single originating number.
Right.
And like whether I trust them or not is based on, like, I don't know, priority in the log.
Right.
Or how do you see that working for that
Yep.
kind of edge case?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, actually. I don't want to prevent, the ability to have multiple delegate certificates for the same TN. I think the onus in general, and people can correct me if they have different interpretation, but the onus is on the one that cares about the telephone number to do the monitoring or have the monitoring happen on their behalf to make sure that they are aware if there's this new certificate that gets created with their telephone number, is that something that they initiated or they are aware of versus it's coming from somewhere else and is a misissued certificate.
Yeah, because you can kind of imagine a couple paths that could go, right? Like I think the way I classically envision delegate certificates working would be, you would get a delegate certificate down to an enterprise and there would just be one, and it would use that delegate cert to communicate to all the OSPs, right, through whom it might send calls, and that those OSPs would in turn, just allow that signature, that passport that was signed with that delegate certificate to go through to the terminating party.
Mhm.
We know in practice, it seems much more likely that each of these OSPs is going to clamp it down, right? Like in their own particular way. And so, I mean, I think this would be an interesting tool to enforce the classical world that I had in mind, if people are willing to look at it that way, which would be cool. But yeah, it was much more just kind of what your intention was in this. So it sounds like your intention is to permit the plurality of these things and really to kind of leave it to the person responsible for the number and relying parties to kind of suss this out.
Yeah, and I think there's cases where you might have multiple call centers that each have different delegate certificates, and you do that intentionally, even though it's the same telephone number, because you want to be able to know where that call originated from.
Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". I made some comments to this end on the list as well on how you would incrementally introduce this solution, because the document is written requires at must strength. It's like, it seems like we just had a similar discussion on the other draft. Requires at must strength the inclusion of the SCT, well, then you can't, it's not backward compatibility. It requires a global flag day upgrade to deploy this thing.
So I interpret the must as being that if I don't have a must for a verification service to expect that, it's going to be valid to not have the receipt, and I validate yes versus not, that to me doesn't work. So that's the intent of the must that I have there. If we want to say that a different way.
So just, can you say that one more time? Because I
Yeah,
didn't
sure.
follow that.
So if I am creating certificates using certificate transparency, I want to make sure that all the verification service check to see if there's a SCT receipt there. Otherwise, it should, I would want that verification to fail.
Sure, but the problem is if a malicious actor is has created this bad certificate and is therefore not using transparency, they're going to opt out of sending the SCT. And how does the verifying server differentiate those two cases?
That's what I'm trying to say. And maybe this needs to get baked more, but that I would set the expectation that if I'm using certificate transparency for my certificates, I want everybody to check for the receipt.
Yeah, but how do you communicate that fact securely? It's the evil bit you're talking about here.
Right. Good point. I mean, it could be part of the ecosystem as well. Like, again, it's
Has
sort
to
of,
be known.
in that sense, it's similar to short-lived.
You just can check the log for the SCT, then why do you have to convey it in the passport in the first place?
Well,
Conversation and mic, please. And we got Alec and Q also.
So the concept of
Get close to the
Close,
mic.
close to the mic, please.
So the concept of adding the SCT list to the passport is about actually transmitting the SCTs. You wouldn't go to the actual append log to get that, because that would be too time consuming, first of all. So that's kind of a way of making sure that you can just look it up and kind of trust that. And in the draft, we also added that if you wanted to check inclusion proof and that more time consuming things, you could run it as a background process optionally. But the presence of the SCT in the passport would be the thing that guarantees the option. And I think your initial question was about backwards compatibility when you don't have that SCT in there. What happens? So this could be, in my personal opinion, either your verifier says, I'm good, I can accept this because I'm not up to speed with this stuff and don't drop it. But the verifier that is updated and now says, okay, I'm introducing a whole new level of, verification against the fraud, I'm going to actually pay attention to that and take it from there. And then I thought, but I forgot.
So this conversation is like shockingly similar to the one we just had on X5C and F5.
Right.
So what I sort of just heard is that the transference in the passport is merely an optimization of bits, right? That to avoid retrieving it over and over again on the receiving side, just like we were talking about for short-lived certs, right? Is that what basically
I think
you're
it's a little more than that.
Okay.
The log is made public to the ecosystem,
Yep.
so that you can validate
Yeah,
that somebody else isn't creating one that looks like yours.
right.
It's not meant to be a per call query to check whether or not that is on the log or not.
It's not a per call query.
The logs aren't fast enough. It's not so much an optimization. It's really just it's a different way. It's somewhat similar, but it's kind of different. But to your point about the question you had earlier, with global rollout, yeah, this is a hard problem. I can tell you how the web world did it. Google Chrome said, effective this date, if your cert doesn't have certificate transparency, it's not going to be trusted. And that forced everyone to do things quickly. There's really not a way to do it otherwise. I think it's kind of outside of the scope of standards, but it has to be a must, or this is useless.
Okay, I'm not an expert on certificate transparency at all. In fact, I know almost nothing. So this may be stupid comments, but like, I would expect something like, okay, if you're a verifier and you're implementing this, right, and the passport shows up and there is no SCT in it, then you go to the log and you get it. And if it's there, great. And if it's not there, it's fraudulent, right? Isn't that what we want?
The log
Too
is
slow.
not intended to get the receipt. It's intended to be a public way that you're monitoring as certificates are getting created
Yeah,
to see, is somebody misissuing one that's using my telephone number or my
right.
SPC or
Okay.
or whatever. It's supposed to be an offline process
Right.
versus an online process
okay, yeah,
in terms of calls.
right. So if not, but is the assumption then that if the verification service is doing this offline, it will have already retrieved?
The
This
offline
thing-
It's
logs
not
are
the
not used by VS.
It's the
Offline logs are used by the monitor only.
Oh,
They're not designed for real-time applications like this.
it's not the verification service doing.
so then
doing
why
that.
are we talking about? Now I'm totally lost. All right, I'll sit down. Thank you.
Alec, you were in queue for something else, or was that it?
Yes. I guess I just had two comments, and I should have sent this in the email. I didn't have a chance. Sorry. I think there's an issue with the SCT that I don't know how to address, but that needs to be addressed with regards to, you could have multiple certificates in the chain, that use transparency. Think about particularly with like delegate certs and a shaken cert that is the parent of the delegate cert that also uses certificate transparency. So you almost need like multiple SCTs for the various certs, right?
I believe those are two different certificates. One,
Right.
the end entity has the SPC. The other one, the intermediate has the SPC, and the end entity is the telephone number. So
Right,
those are-
but both of those could use transparency. And if
Yes.
the delegate cert is used to sign a passport, what's in the SCT claim of the passport? The
Those would
SCT
be-
for you, because you want both. You need, let's say the delegate end entity cert, the delegate cert, the end entity cert is put into 2 logs. So there's 2 SCTs, and then the intermediate cert, the shaken cert, is put into 2 logs. So there's 4 SCTs you need to transmit. I don't think you want to just put them all in one array because you need to know which goes with which.
I think both of those certificates would be used to sign 2 different passports and would have 2 different SCTs and are 2 completely different certificates, if I'm hearing you right.
I guess, what if there wasn't a shaken passport? What if it was just a delegate passport? An RCD passport or something signed with the delegate cert. There was no passport signed with the shaken cert. Certificate transparency can be used by certs other than the end entity.
That's right.
And so we need a structure to handle that. I don't know how to solve that problem, but I think we need to solve that problem.
Okay, maybe we
Can I-
can connect offline on that.
Can I suggest we have a call about this?
Go ahead.
Maybe, because I think
Quickly.
this is something actually having like a little call about, because there's a
Yeah,
lot of
definitely.
things here I think we need to untangle about how we imagine this is going to work. I don't think what Jonathan's saying crazy, but I think there are solutions though in that space, but maybe we should have a call about all this.
Are
Yeah.
you suggesting a informal side meeting sort of call or something that
Yeah,
we set
yeah.
up? Okay.
Yeah, or it could be a formal interim, I don't know, but I have the feeling there is at least an hour's worth of material for us to tease out
Yes.
of this. It would probably be good if we had a call about it.
It is a complex topic, so I think more discussion is always good.
Okay, we need to move to the next presentation if we're going to end in time.
Okay, so this is a new draft that I wanted to present. Vesper, verifiable STI personas, of course. It's funny, I just walked down 2 blocks and there's a big Vesper on the building, so it must be a sign or something. But Vesper is the preferred martini of James Bond, so that's where that comes from. So this is all to talk about formalizing something we've been discussing, at least in the stir and shaken industry for a while, vetting, KYC, but also bring in a lot of the concepts and current discussions that are happening in other forums in IETF. I think sort of the evolving 3-party model, issuer, holder, verifier, that aligns well with vetting and KYC process. I also wanted to make sure we incorporate some of the telephone number specific concepts in here, potentially the idea of selective disclosure in order to keep privacy, potentially law enforcement things where if there's a bad actor and they're not willing to disclose information, I know that's a sensitive subject, but something we can do in hopefully a fairly privacy-centric way. Would love to have that discussion as well. So I think, things are sort of coming together really well, discussed in Spice and Skid as well. So I think there's a lot of great concepts that are very applicable to some of the things we want to do to talk about a secure telephone identity and maybe revisit it again. Next slide. So some of the key concepts here, selectively disclosable token. Right now we're using SDJOT. There was actually some questions on the list about extending that to some of the CBOR stuff as well. So I'd love to have that discussion too. We also incorporated transparency into this. If you're going to want to be trusted that you're an entity and that you're unique, and that somebody is not trying to take your identity, transparency is a good concept there. So we included some of that in the draft. Yeah. Components that maintain security integrity of that Vesper protocol. Next slide. Just defining sort of things that correspond to the three-party model. So the vetting agent, the one that actually issues the tokens and does the actual vetting. The vetting entity that wants to represent themselves. They act as the holder in the three-party model, and then the vetting verifier that actually wants to validate that you are who you say you are. Next slide. I think I sort of covered a lot of this already, so we can go to the next slide. So there's a number of examples that I put in here. Obviously, one of the big things, and this sort of, I always refer back to the CATA working group that said you need to do two main things. You need to do KYC and vet an entity, but you also need to make sure that they are associated with the right to use that telephone number. So I see that as probably the key use case here. But there's room for a lot of other interesting information about that entity that we can put in there. I put business IDs in the examples. I put rich call data in there. There's a lot of other interesting concepts I think we can go in. Consent might be another one. The FCC is talking a lot about that in terms of consent to use AI. You know, there's potentially a lot of interesting ways that this could be used where folks are vetted. Even Henning had a draft about like whether you're a telemarketer or emergency services, like, you know, some of those things could be brought back in and verified and vetted. I think that covers this one. Next slide. Yeah, some of this is repeating, you know, the transparency, making sure that the ecosystem is able to verify and trust. Obviously, the vetting agents have to be trusted within the ecosystem and trusted by the verifier in order for this to work. And like I said before, we have standard APIs for the transparency logs. Next slide. Okay, so here's the example I was talking about. And I sort of borrowed, did you want to ask a question, John? I followed the pattern from the SDJOT thing where the input claims that get vetted this could be an example. So I said like RCD is in there, business IDs are in there, the telephone number, array of telephone numbers potentially, the business name, the contact that's associated, the authorized contact that's associated with that business. All the things that have been discussed in terms of doing good KYC practices. Next slide. And this is sort of what a SDJOT looks like. I'm not going to go through all the detail there unless you have specific questions, but just so you can see an example of SDJOT. I think that might be it for this one. Yep. John? No, I'm done. I'm done.
Yeah, so I guess one question I had about this up front. So definitely, I get why we need something that has this property and communicates this information. And I was super interested to read actually about selective disclosure, which I had not read about before as a capability in JOTS. And like I've long believed that we were going to reach a point where we needed some kind of like encryption within passports because there are going to be things that are going to be sensitive, like geographical information, for example,
Right.
that, you know, it would be great to be able to restrict in terms of who was able to access those. As we know, these passports just kind of get thrown over the wall, right, from the originating side. It can go who knows where they end up at the terminating side and like the intended recipient, and all the information that's in this basically clear text, right? But you know, when I look at this, I mean, a lot of the properties, especially when we're talking about KYC and like and for those not familiar with this idea of know your customer, this is parlance that is used broadly in I'd say the superset of systems that have been built on top of StirShaken as StirShaken has rolled out to represent instances where there are entities that go through a process, some kind of a due diligence to ascertain who the identity of a person really is behind a telephone number. And they want to have a way to be able to express that, maybe a limited way that involves selective disclosure, but they at least need to know it so that we can get around precisely the kinds of problems I was discussing earlier, where if an enterprise is, you know, sending its calls out through multiple originating service providers that aren't the people that issued them the telephone number they are using as their calling number, having a relationship between who the OSP is and the enterprise that's sending a call seems super important. But like, because of the relatively static nature of this information, in other words, this isn't information that's like about the call. It's about like an entity behind it.
Right.
I was always vaguely envisioning that if we're going to go down this path, we would do it in the certs. That all this information would actually be part of the X509 that like is in the delegate cert that we issue to these entities, because it doesn't need to be part of the way at a passport level that we tag this information on a per call basis. It's instead fundamental security information about who the entity is that's originating the call. It's relatively long lived. It's not terribly dynamic. It may have a lot of this kind of metadata in it, right?
Mhm.
And so I guess my first question is kind of, did you consider that as an alternative to approaching this through a JOT? And kind of what do you think the trade-offs are there between those approaches?
So actually, I started the same place, but that's maybe the nature of that. We've been talking a lot about certs and things like that. I think really at the end of the day, it's a container, and maybe there's others that can comment more comprehensively than I can on some of these things. But I think adopting the framework that's being discussed is actually a big part of this as well, in terms of like the
Well,
three-party
and we should
model.
get to the framework in a minute. I know Jonathan wants to talk about the framework a bit, but just from a, you know, modularity and division of where the security associations are, who forms them and why, right?
Mhm.
Like the notion that this is happening as a part of like call processing on a per call basis, that this information gets added to what appears in the passport, seems to me like it's a counterintuitive place for that kind of information to end up being associated with the parties that are making calls.
So I don't believe I put too much opinion into how that actually gets added, but this definitely is not, this is not a per call. It's either referenced or included per call, but it's definitely not being created necessarily. Well,
Well, if
I
it
guess
needs to be created per call, that makes the
depends
argument
how-
for it being in the JOT stronger. My point is, at least the kind of information that you're talking about here seems much more like the way you enroll people into the security, into the PKI to start with, right? Is figuring out, we vetted them and this is their address and this is their business ID, their EIN or whatever.
Well-
Like that's all stuff I would imagine happening at the point that a delegate certificate, for example, is being issued to an entity that's going to originate calls.
So I think
So why
to me-
doesn't that work?
to me, the certificates associated with the ability to sign passports are different than the authority that a vetter is given to be trusted by a verification service. I think those are two related but orthogonal concepts. And that's why I kept them separate. Or I think we should keep them separate.
Quick time check. There are 10 minutes left in this working group meeting.
This is also a topic that we could talk for a long time about as well. But probably, I don't know if we're ready for a separate call on this, but I think it needs to sink in a little more for folks. But I totally recognize that this is a big 500-pound gorilla that is being dumped on the group. So
We've also seen very little discussion on the list, so stimulate more.
We had some
yes,
today.
absolutely.
Uh,
Rob?
Rob Shiva, thank you for the comments. That actually will help to guide some of the updates and conversations.
You've
But
got to
really
get a
quickly, the
lot
idea-
closer to the microphone.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
far still. Okay, sorry. And the main idea I think about the Vesper token is to create sort of like a standard way of sharing KYC, KYB information, because a lot of people use different companies for vetting and so on. And it would be nice to have for this ecosystem a way to say, well, you can continue using whoever you want and so on, but then express it in some common way. And the SDJOT also gives us a nice property of, issuer holder verifier. So in case of delegates, you can have a situation where vetting entity can go to vetting agency or call center and so on, and then just receive this token that can be used further for the calls that they do, and they can just do this on their behalf. So that's kind of where I think this was going. So.
Yeah, I think there's also an interesting property using selective disclosure that per call you may want to disclose different things to depending who you're calling. So that's something else to recognize as part of this.
The idea of using transparency service in there is that someone doesn't just claim that they did this and did that vetting and so on. So that's
Yeah,
John?
I mean, and to me, obviously, the interesting part about making sure people don't just claim they do this, these are the kinds of things I typically would associate with the enrollment into a PKI. And this question of whether it needs to be different on a per call basis, this is the kind of thing I think that helps make decisions about what the right place to stage this is in. So understanding those requirements a lot better, I think would help clarify for me anyway, why this is the right path versus doing this in the certs themselves. I would say, of course, there is a tremendous amount of flexibility available in X509 as well for these things, and for indeed using indirection and similar mechanisms to make sure that not everybody who is accessing the X509 cert has access to all the information that's in it. But at the end of the day, we probably do need a broader list discussion around this to get at what the fundamental kind of requirements are around it. I know I just feel more comfortable when I think about what the job of a verification service is, and indeed what the job is of somebody like an intermediate CA issuing a cert to an enterprise. I want them to be doing this work as part of that, and I want what their perception is of who this enterprise is and things like that to be part of what they bake into it, because presumably they're the people on the hook. I mean, at the end of the day, if there's a security failure, if there's fraud or something, the issuer of the certificate is the person who's holding the bag, right, for the behavior of that enterprise. And that's why, this, depending on what our threat model is and what kinds of things we think might arise, that's why my intuition would be that that's the proper place to stage a lot of this. It could be there's a smaller role for selective disclosure that is, in the passport itself. And like I said, I've envisioned for a while, there should be a way to do encryption in passports. And the stuff that's per call might go to that, but the more fundamental, hey, I vetted this entity, they're this business, this is their EIN and all this kind of stuff. That seems to me like enrollment into the PKI phase bubble stuff.
Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". So this whole conversation sort of reveals to me what is my main comment, which is this is just missing a framework for how we intend to overlay this in the real world and use it. Like, is this for call processing? Is this for validating enrollment? Who are the actors in the system that are using these things? It's very meta on just reading of the document. Like, there's verifiers and there's issues and there's vetters. Who are these people? What decisions are these carriers? Are these CAs? It's like, it seems like, what is it we're trying to solve with this thing? Even the question of whether it's a call time or not question is just an indicator that we're missing that framework. So that'd be my feedback, is like, it seems like there's like some giant picture of the whole system of different actors in an ecosystem that's like in your head or something. And we zeroed in on this little interesting crypto part of the problem, which is like missing this other big picture. And it's just hard to reason about fundamental questions like this without that big picture. So
I would
write a
agree.
framework.
I would agree that, not everything is there. I think there's a little more than what you said, but I tried to incorporate some actors and things like that. But I do agree, like that's some of the discussion that I had hoped to have, and not just, it was a time issue as well, like getting all that into one document. But no, that is another out of band process that, yeah, that is definitely not a call time. You don't vet on a call.
Pierce?
Pierce.
Cool. So I get almost the last word, but Chris will have the last word. I'm going to add one to Jonathan Rosenberg's comments and to John Peterson, because they're both saying something similar, which is, well, one thing is you need a framework, and the other is a lot of this information, you want to be able to use it at call time, but you wouldn't want it communicated in the call, except maybe as a reference that you would download and parse and understand, just like you would a X509 security certificate. I was curious of just the selective disclosure JOT and not a more broad look at what was being done in the W3C for verifiable credentials, which is where I think this, came from originally, where the concept would be, if you want to learn about the identity and some trust attributes about that identity, you could find those in a decentralized identifier document. And that could be referenced from that could be a reference within an extension in the X509 security certificate. So I'll just say, I agree with the framework, whether you do, whether you would embrace what the W3C is put for their framework on how to model verifiable credentials, verifiable presentations, etc. But I really like that you're working on this, Chris. I think this is a good direction.
Yep. I think for the VC discussion, I would refer you to SPICE and other working groups that are having animated discussions about this stuff. So
you did, and I'm already looking at it. Thank you.
Yep. And I think we would want to, sort of align ourselves with that, with the discussions that are happening there, like I mentioned. So very much something that will be evolving, but trying to give a use case that can be applied to those things and have us fit in a bigger, like I can see this as a bigger IETF where we're all jointly building each of the components of this framework, and this is just one application that gets applied to the whole three-party model and identity and all that stuff. So very much a starting point. Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
You have 2 minutes. You have time to plug it. That's it.
Okay. I did give a review, some details on the list as well, on the SIP core list, but just to give an update, there has been a lot of discussion lately. There was a great discussion at the last IPNNI meeting, specifically for how we make sure that call info is relevant, and had a very good discussion on very much differentiating NNI versus UNI use of this. This is very much intended to be or at least the latest updates to it are very much intended to support the UNI interface, where there's an established trust relationship versus if it's over NNI, obviously we want you to use more of the passports and identity headers. The biggest update that we were sort of questioning, should we put it in? But I think they're actually very valid and relevant updates are the verified parameter and the integrity parameter. There was a lot of discussion about, if we have integrity on URI reference content, we want to make sure that can be validated at the UE. That's actually going to be the thing that downloads it and displays it to the user if it's a logo. So we wanted to make sure we had a mechanism to pass the integrity hashes along with that. Verified is just sort of intended to be a very simple indicator that just tells that the sender can say, I actually validated this through an RCD passport or whatever mechanism they use to, or a shaken with an RCD or whichever flavor of RCD they're using. Did I have any other slides? Yeah, so I put out a version. I didn't make the deadline. I put out a new version this morning, but it's mostly minor editorial fixes to address one of Paul's comments, and then some offline comments that I got from some IPNNI participants. Gene.
Jean Mahoney, SIPCOR co-chair. So we've had technical updates to this. It had a working group last call.
Right.
I think it would need another one.
Yes.
Given the updates. Richard Shockey indicated on lists something about artificial intelligence. Is there further updates for this document, or can
No.
we do?
No, we are
No,
definitely
we're
done. We are definitely done now.
You're done. Okay, so we could do another working
Yes.
group last call.
We should.
All right,
Absolutely. I was going to come talk to you about that.
awesome.
So yes, so hopefully it will all be unlocked. I think it was worth the delay. I think we're more aligned now. So hopefully we're all in a good place.
Okay, we've run over time, but thank you for your attention and enjoy the rest of the meeting.
Also, one parting comment. Since lots of people that are really interested in this are in this room, and this draft is a blocking dependency for our RCD draft, I would invite everyone to please go participate in that SIPCOR working group last call.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.